So we will be beginning this week, as we continue walking through the Old Testament, our study of the book of Leviticus. Now this study is going to be a minimum of 2 weeks. We'll see how far we get today, and next week it could possibly be 3. Leviticus it's right around, I believe, 25 chapters, so they're starting to get shorter if you've been reading through them. 27 chapters in Leviticus. So they're starting to get a little easier. So a chapter a day puts you right about a month if you want to do it that way. But the book of Leviticus, third book of the Bible, third book of the Pentateuch, written by Moses according to Jewish and Christian tradition through the years. And Leviticus is one of those books that anybody who's read through the Bible and tried to go straight through it, Leviticus is usually where people start losing steam. Right? Anybody ever tried to read through the Bible straight through? And Leviticus is, Genesis and Exodus have some pretty exciting stories, but they're really, really long. And if you're an achiever type person like me that likes to check everything off your list, when you've got to get through 50 chapters to check a book off your list, it starts getting a little tricky. So Leviticus is one of those books that we always feel, man, we really should be excited because we're supposed to be excited about reading our Bibles. But if we're honest, we often don't come to this with a lot of excitement, which I'm not saying is okay or right, but if we're just being honest, that's where we're at. Which means I'm really excited to preach about it for 3 weeks. But really, when we look at the book of Leviticus, we find it is so absolutely crucial. One of the biggest mistakes that we make when reading the Old Testament, I'm not going to say one of the biggest mistake we make when we read the Old Testament, and this is possibly not exemplified more than in the book of Leviticus. The biggest mistake we make when reading the Old Testament is that we read the Old Covenant without the light of the New Covenant. That we read the beginning without the end, that we have the beginning without the end in mind, and we look at the Old Testament on its own and not as it is fulfilled in Christ. Reading the Old Testament without constantly connecting it to and reading it in light of the New Testament, it's kind of like listening to a joke and never getting the punchline, right? Does that make sense? Like if you hear somebody tells you a joke and then you're on the phone and your best friend's telling you the funniest joke they've ever heard, if they cut off right before the punchline, are you going to say, wow, that was the best story I've ever heard? Probably not, because all of those, my wife's jokes are really, really great examples of this. Because my wife's jokes, until you get the punchline, they make no sense whatsoever. All right? That's just the type of joke that she tells. And some of my wife's joke, you actually have to hear the punchline of 3 jokes later to get the first one. And if you've allowed my wife to tell you jokes, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But you realize that the whole point of a joke is that none of it makes sense until you get the punchline. That is what fulfills the joke and makes it actually make sense. None of our jokes are just great stories without that humorous piece at the end that ties them all together. Now, it's a loose metaphor, but it's a good metaphor for how the Bible works. Not that Jesus is a joke. Nobody write that down in your notes and go tell somebody that's what your pastor said. But without the story of Jesus, nothing in the Old Testament is what God intended for it to be, because Jesus was always the goal of everything that God was doing. And we talked about this when we were way back in Genesis, this idea of, you remember the metaphor I used back then is how something can happen in an instant that takes an incredibly long time to fix. That if you take a $200,000 sports car and you go around a corner at 100 miles an hour, lose traction and flip over the side and roll it 12 times, it takes 10 seconds to destroy that automobile. And if you tried to take it home and using only hand tools, put it back together the way it was, it would take you years and years and years. And we've all had times like that in our lives where we made one little mistake. We said the wrong thing to one person at the wrong time, and it took a lifetime to repair that relationship. Has anybody had experiences like that? You don't have to raise your hands, but you can if you want to. Thanks, guys. I appreciate the people that raise their hands anyway. I never want to put pressure on you if you're like one of those not hand-raising kind of people. But I appreciate you that ignore that direction because it makes me look like I'm not crazy. So we've all had those moments in our lives where you say one thing to someone, just one, maybe it wasn't even the wrong thing to say, or maybe you didn't think about it, or maybe you just made a mistake, you acted out of anger, and you destroyed a relationship, and it took years and years to rebuild it. Remember, that is the story of the Old Testament. That the story of the Old Testament is God rebuilding the relationship with his creation that was broken through sin. That so suddenly the unity and the intimacy between God and his people that's displayed in the first few chapters of Genesis was snapped off and sent this shockwave through the earth of sin that just broke the system that God had put in place. It broke creation the way it was intended. And all of the Old Testament leads up to the New Testament, where Jesus will finally begin to set things right. But all of the Old Testament is incomplete without being fulfilled in the New. And that's what we're going to look at today in the book of Leviticus and how it ties in to Christ. Because without that, Leviticus in particular is a bit odd. So if you've read ahead a little bit, the book of Leviticus is in some ways a little bit better in Vermont just because we have a kind of a hunting and farming culture. The number of people in our building right now that know how to successfully gut an animal and pull its insides out is significantly higher than if I were to preach this message somewhere else in the country. I'm going to raise our hands for this one. How many people have gutted a deer or cow or other animal, chickens, any kind of? Okay, so we've got quite a few hands up. How many it's because? Put your hands up again, and if you are a hunter who's just not that great at it, so you haven't had the opportunity, then you can also raise your hands. I know that there's a couple of you out there that I saw. Jacob was one of them. Jacob's getting his bow license this year, and he's only been here for a couple years, so we got to cut him some slack. But so the number of people in our congregation who have had that experience is significantly higher than if we were, in the city somewhere. So this is a little bit easier for us to take in. But if you read through the book of Leviticus, really a lot of what happens here is pretty gruesome. The word entrails shows up more times than I'm comfortable reading out loud in a sermon. And so essentially what we have happening in the book of Leviticus is that God is giving instructions for what is supposed to happen in worship in the tabernacle and what will eventually be the temple in order to remove sin from the people. And so a lot of what we have in Leviticus is laws and regulations about offerings. And so if this happens, this is the type of animal you need to use. A lot of it gets really particular. If you're giving a grain offering, how are you supposed to cook the food? Are you supposed to burn it or not burn it? Are the priests allowed to eat it? Are they not allowed to eat it? And we're not going to get into details of a lot of this stuff because we just don't have the time. But as you read through, if you try to read this straight through, which I recommend you do, and I'll tell you why later on in the message, you will begin to understand that there's just a lot of details about how to cut animals apart. Okay? There's a lot of details about how to cut animals apart. That's a pretty good part of the book of Leviticus. Now, there's a couple things that I want us to be thinking about this morning, because let me give you the idea that we're confronting. Okay? The idea that we're confronting when we look at books like the book of Leviticus, where God just gives rule after rule after rule, it seems like God is so picky about his sacrifices. And you have to use it this way and not this way, and you can't spill this kind of blood, and you can't do this, and you can't, and it's incredible. I mean, again, 27 chapters of details about how to properly kill animals in worship. And so the idea that we're confronting is this idea that God just makes up all of these things about how we are supposed to worship him. One of the ideas that's prevalent in our culture for people that are not Christians, that are from the outside looking in at what we believe, is why does God make up all of these rules? Why did God tell us that things have to be this way? Who is he to tell me how to live my life? Which, of course, one very good answer to that question is he's the one who created you. But even beyond that is, well, why does he just get to make up the way things are? Why does he just get to make up what's okay and what's not okay? Why did God just decide that the Israelites had to kill a bunch of animals so that he wouldn't be mad at them anymore? That seems awfully fickle, doesn't it? That God just made this rule, that he made these rules up and they disobeyed and he made up this punishment. Why would he do that? And so here's where we really need to start when we're reading through Leviticus or any of the Old Testament, is an understanding of who God is. And what we understand about God is that God was eternal from beginning to end, from our perspective, right? I actually didn't even mean to say that. You recognize that our human minds always have to have a beginning and an end, all right? I made that mistake on purpose for you guys to illustrate this. You realize that in our finite human minds, everything has a beginning and an end. But that's not how God is. That when we had our beginning, whatever that looked like, when there was nothing and then all of a sudden there was something, when life began, when the universe began, when time began, God already was. So he was eternal in both directions. Everything that we see and experience is from beginning to end. God is eternal to eternal, which means that God always was, and he exists separate from the creation. And so what we also recognize is that God is pure, and he is holy, and he is perfect, and he is unchanging. These are all of the ways that the Bible describes him. And what that means is I have days where I act one way, and I have days where I act another way. As I grow older, my beliefs change, thankfully. My attitudes change, equally thankfully, right? I grow up and I become different. I have different attitudes, I have different beliefs, I have different understandings. That was never true of God. God never changed. He just is what he is, right? He is what he is. And at the very heart of who he is are really, the heart of God, of who God is, can be described with two things primarily. One is love and one is relationship. Now, I'm not saying that that's like what God is made of, right? This isn't like a sugar and spice and everything nice kind of thing. This is just how we describe God at the core of his being, is he is the essence of love and relationship. We believe that God is a Trinity, and the reason that that is so significant is that even before creation, God existed with the Son and with the Spirit, and he always existed in relationship. That relationship is at the heart of who God is, which is why he created us to be relational beings, and to be in relationship with one another and to be in relationship with him. That when God created, it was not because of a need he had, right? God didn't say, I need this resource and I'm going to create something to farm it for me. God didn't create us to give resource to him. God created us so he could resource us. He did not create us because he was lonely and he needed friends. He was already existing in perfect relationship. He created so that he could share that relationship even farther than he already was. And so what that tells us is that creation is literally just God taking everything about himself and physically manifesting who he was into the reality that we see around us. And so what that tells us is if God was always the same, if God is never changing, I've got a sneeze coming. No, I don't. If God is never changing, he's never shifting, he's never changing his understanding, and if he created the world as an outpouring of who he is, as a reflection of who he is, that sin is not something that God arbitrarily just made up. That it's not that God said, well, I've got every action that people could ever do and every attitude that people could ever have. And this isn't God going, sin, 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 not sin, sin, not sin, not sin, 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 sin. That's not how it worked. It wasn't arbitrary. It was an outpouring of who he was. Let me give you an example. Again, this is a metaphor. As with any metaphor, don't take it too far. Parents, your kids come up to you. They're 11 or 12 years old, so at this point they know everything. They come up to you and say, Mom and Dad, why did you decide that we have to eat food? Why did you? Because here's the thing. You make me do the dishes. And I really don't like to do the dishes. And it's occurred to me that if you had just decided that our family would be a family that didn't eat food, then I would have much fewer chores. I wouldn't have to wash the table. We wouldn't have to mop the floor. We wouldn't have to clean up the counters. We'd empty the garbage half as often, and I would never have to do dishes. So why did you decide that we would be a family that ate food? Well, you'd say to your wonderfully brilliant 12-year-old, you'd say, well, we didn't decide to eat food. We are just people that need to eat. And so we eat food. It is born out of our nature. And so the structure of our family life, now you can do meals any way you want. You can eat dinner at 5 o'clock or 7 o'clock, and you can eat on the couch. You can eat meals a lot of different ways, but the fact is that all of us in every single one of our families, food is involved in our lives because as human beings, part of the way that we exist is we exist with a need for food. And so that's just a part of what we do. And so again, don't take this metaphor to God created us because he needs us, because that's not what we're talking about. But when we look at sin, sin was not, when my girls were born, Rachel and I didn't look at each other and say, now, well, are we going to be a family that eats meals or doesn't eat meals? Because we got to make a decision. Now, we had discussions like that about other things. And we talked about when we're going to eat and what things we're going to do together and what our Sabbath is going to look like. We all, as families, make decisions about certain things, but food is never one of them because that is a given, because it is just a part of who we are. Now, when God gave us the law, when God named what sin was, that's how it happened. That it wasn't God arbitrarily picking and choosing what things he decided to be okay with and what things he decided he wasn't okay with. He literally took his nature, looked at what his nature was, and said, these things occur within my nature, these things occur within my relationship, and these things don't. That when you exist in a relationship like the relationship between the Trinity, murder does not work. All right? There was never a plot for Jesus to kill the Holy Spirit. That doesn't exist in that relationship. And so murder is a sin, not because God decided it was wrong, not because God thought it was impractical for the populating of his planet, but because murder exists in a spirit that is contrary to the unchanging nature of God. And so we have to remember that when we read through our Bibles, and even us Christians need a reminder of this sometimes, when we talk about sin, it's not just something that God made up. God is identifying a reality for us. That when God tells us this is holy and this is sin, he's saying this is within my nature and this is outside of it. And so if you want to be in a relationship with me, if you want to live the way that I created you to live, and this is how we've talked about, hey, the other metaphor that I've used for this is, hey, you can go to your car manufacturer and say, look, I know you tell me to put oil in it, but I'm going to do water because it's cheaper. I'm not paying $10 a quart for oil when I can just get water out of the river. It's slippery. It's a liquid. It'll work. You put water in the engine of your car, it's not going to last too long because it wasn't created to do that. That God says, this is how you were created to live because you were created in my image within my creation. And so he is not making up rules. He is revealing the nature of who you are. That when God comes in your life and says, what you're doing is a sin, your reaction shouldn't be, whoa, hey, who gave you the authority, and why do you just get to make up what's sin in my life? First of all, again, he could do that, and that would be a perfectly fair answer, but he goes so far even beyond that. He says, look, I didn't make this up. This is just the way you are. I am just revealing, hey, I noticed you're putting water in the oil cap in your car. That's not going to work out so well for you. And if you went to your neighbor and said, hey, man, I noticed you're putting oil in your engine, your motor's probably going to blow, and he just went off on you for being judgmental and overbearing, and how dare you, and I can do whatever, it's my car, and I'll put whatever I want to do into it, you'd say, all right. But he would be completely unjustified. You weren't making things up. You weren't trying to tell him what to do. You were revealing the nature of his possession. That when God talks to us about sin is going on in our lives. Now, here's why this is so important in Leviticus. Because what that tells us is that when God talks to us about removing sin and being forgiven of sin, it's not God saying, look, I made up this arbitrary rule, and you broke it, and now I'm mad. You got to make me feel better. That's not what we're talking about. Now, if you want to think theologically, there's a couple really rather long words that describe this, and they're important because they're talked about a lot among scholars of the Old Testament. The two words are expiation and propitiation. Okay, big words. You can write them down if you want to. If not, just remember the definitions. That's what's important. But basically, there's two different ways we can look at forgiveness. Okay? The first way that we can look at forgiveness, and this is how people often view God, is through this word propitiation. Now, what that means is it is the idea that you've done something to me, and I am mad at you. And you earning my forgiveness is about me no longer being upset. Okay? So you come over to my house, and you take a baseball bat, and you put it right through the windshield of my truck. All right? I'm upset about it. I'm mad about it. and you are remorseful, you feel bad, you say, I don't know what I was thinking, I don't know why I did that. You come apologize, you pay for a new windshield, we talk about it, and I say, I forgive you, in the sense of I am no longer upset with you. And so one of the ways that we can view the sacrifices in the Old Testament is that it is just our way to make sure God isn't mad at us. Now, this is the way that every other pagan religion worked. That every other pagan religion that happened around the Israelites, it was all about keeping the gods happy. But when scholars go back, when they analyze the language, when they look at the teachings and the tradition, when you really get into it, and really even if you just read your Bible as a whole, if you read it from beginning to end and think about and look at how God views forgiveness, we realize that that's not actually what's going on when we talk about forgiveness. That when forgiveness is discussed throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New, it's not the idea of propitiation, it's the idea of expiation, which is not, God's not mad at you anymore. It literally has to do with you yourself and your standing before Him. And so the idea is, who does your sin affect, you or God? When you sin, is God just mad and He's hurt and He's upset and it makes Him have a bad day and He gets all grumpy? Or does sin actually affect you? And what we understand is, both because of the language used to describe it, and as we see the effects of sin on people in the Bible, and as you look at the effects of sin in your life, we realize that being forgiven of sin is more about us being justified before Him in a change that occurs in us than a change that occurs in God's attitude or God's nature. Because you see, we don't have to convince God to forgive us. We don't have to convince God to have grace. He has those things inherently. And so when we're looking at the laws in Leviticus, we're not looking at, wow, look at this ridiculous list of what we have to do just to make God happy. What we're looking at is God gives us an image of, you have sinned, you have brought evil into your life. This is what it takes to get rid of it. This is what it takes to heal yourself of the sin that you have brought into your life. And here's why Leviticus is so crucial. You read through Leviticus and you say to yourself, man, this is really gruesome. This is really harsh. There are some passages in here that sound fairly disgusting. There are some things in Leviticus that are just, they're tough, right? We have this really, really tough image, and it's at times hard to get through, because you think, man, this is absolutely barbaric. But Leviticus is the beginning of God teaching His people, the Israelites and us, of exactly how bad sin is. Because here's one of the biggest things that happens to us believers. This is the easiest way that Satan just absolutely grabs hold of your life. Is you commit a sin, you do something you know you're absolutely not supposed to do, whether it's a substance, whether it's a lustful thought or action, whether it's the way you respond to somebody, and then you turn around, you walk away, you put it in the back of your mind, you put it in your back pocket, and you don't think about it anymore. You say, I did it, it's over, it's done, nobody found out, nobody knew. Hey, it's not a big deal, all right? This ties back into our discussion in John of physical versus spiritual reality, of allowing God to show us what's happening below. Because when you only look at your life physically, you have to get pretty entrenched in sin before you recognize how bad it's hurting you. If all you look at is the physical, you can cheat on your wife for 10 years. Until she finds out and leaves you, there's no consequence. You don't see anything going wrong with that circumstance. But if you had opened up your eyes to see what was spiritually happening, you would realize that the moment you began to look at women that were not your wife, there was a wedge put between your relationship. The moment you began to look at women other than your wife lustfully, you said, Satan, come into my heart and teach me how to have a sexual relationship with somebody. And then you brought that into your house, which affected your wife and your kids. If we look spiritually at our lives, we recognize the effects of sin. If all we see is the physical, you get really far down that road before you see any negative effect. And so what God was doing through these sacrifices, one of the things that God was doing is just showing the people of Israel, this is how bad your sin is. When you bring sin into your life, you want to see what sin looks like physically. You want a physical reminder of how bad it is when you lust after another woman, or when you lash out in anger, or you allow yourself to be consumed with pride or jealousy. You're going to get a reminder every single week when you come to worship of exactly how much sin can mess you up. For me, at least, those are the two biggest reasons for these sacrifices. One is that sin needed a price to be paid to remove it. That we brought it in, that we bought it, so to speak, and there had to be death to remove it from us so that we could live as God called us to live. And two, it was God's way to show us this is exactly how bad sin is. One way that is that's noted, Leviticus 5, chapter 5, verse 7. What's really interesting about Leviticus, this is not just some system that God made up. This is not just, this is the price you have to pay, and if you sin this much, this is your payment. One of the things that's really interesting about Leviticus is that Leviticus was, it shows the impartiality of God. And if you read chapter 5, verse 7, what it talks about is essentially if a man cannot afford a lamb, then he shall, I'll just read it, then he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for the sin that he has committed 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. And so basically what's going on here is as Moses is writing, he says, look, the price for sin is a lamb. But hey, if you can't afford that, then here's a second option. Here's a cheaper option. And what that tells us is, first of all, that this was not a way to oppress the poor and make things easier on the rich. That if you were poor, you didn't just have to spend all of your income to be forgiven. That God made a way for everyone to fall under forgiveness. And so it wasn't about the lamb. It wasn't about the bird. It wasn't just necessarily about the animal itself. It was about the person standing before God. And so what we find out is that the sacrifices were about cleansing ourselves, not just making God so he isn't mad anymore. We find out that they existed to show us exactly how bad sin was. And we find out that it wasn't meant to just place judgment on people in certain life circumstances. There's blood everywhere in the book of Leviticus. It gets poured, it gets sprinkled, there's blood everywhere. And that was what the Israelites had in mind. That's what the disciples had in mind when they sat at that table for the Last Supper. That when we talk about blood in the church, usually on a Sunday morning, that's a fairly abstract concept. Right? When we talk about our churches are nice and clean, ish. Our church is fairly clean, but when we talk about blood in the churches, right? It's an abstract concept for us because we never really have any blood in our church. Cross our fingers. Other than when like a kid falls and we don't have blood in our church. But for the disciples, remember, they're still living in the system. So the disciples, as they sat around that table with Jesus, they'd been going to the temple and witnessing these sacrifices for their entire lives. So the idea of blood in church to them was very tangible. It was very real. So as they sat around that table, he said, this is the new covenant and my blood, which is poured out for you. So it's the first Sunday of the month, so as usual, we're going to take communion today. I didn't really plan it this way, but it works out. As I prepared for church this morning, that we get together, we're going to take communion, and we've got some broken up matzah, and we've got some very holy grape juice that we bought at Price Dropper. Here's what I want you to think about. Real simple concept. Real simple concept. As you come to the front when we take communion, And I'll probably have you come first, and then I'll finish talking when you get back to your seats. But when you come up, you're going to come to the front, take the juice in the cup, and then you're going to walk back to your seats. As you walk along the front, we have a very different concept of altar in the church now than they did back then. And the altar was actually absent from the Christian church for a number of years. Maybe something we can talk about at a later date, but look at what our concept of an altar is right now. So as you come up, when you have the juice and the bread in your hand, here's what I want you to think about. I want you to walk along the front, and I want you to think about how clean our altars are. I want you to think about how clean our altars are. We have white paint on our altars. Because here's the thing, church. For every gruesome passage in Leviticus, for every unbelievably inhumane or grotesque or barbaric practice that we think we see, all of that was put on him. And we would not understand the significance of the cross without Leviticus. We would not understand the significance that this went on for thousands of years. I cannot comprehend the number of animals that were killed for the sins of the thousands of years before Jesus. But then in a moment when he hung on the cross, that stopped, that ended. We no longer needed those sacrifices. That for thousands and thousands of years, thousands and thousands of people brought animals to be killed, and the blood would just run down over the altars, and it would pour out and run down the floor. But then just with the shedding of his blood, all that was over. That we don't live in this system anymore, where we are constantly trying to keep up with keeping our sins clean. It's already done in him. So when we come together and we drink and we eat, it is the remembrance of what he did to fulfill what we read in Leviticus. It is the remembrance of what he did that goes above and beyond everything that we used to have to do. So that our altars, like our hearts, like our conscience, can be clear. You bow your heads. Lord, as we prepare as your people to come to your table, God, I pray that